Hi, everyone, and hi, Cherionna. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
And today we're going to start a bit differently than our previous conversations. So I'm just going to give the floor to you, Cherionna. And yeah, could you welcome us in?
Yeah, well, welcome. Welcome is the first principle of the principles that I work with from my mentor, Ray Castellino. So welcoming ourselves, welcoming each other, and welcoming this moment, whatever arises. So what you'd suggested, Magda, I like the idea of starting with a little bit of meditation, which to me is about welcoming the moment and perhaps welcoming ourselves as well. So I'd love to lead us through a few minutes of just settling and arriving here a bit more. I notice I take a breath with that. I invite you to notice if you do, if there's any breath there, what it's like. And I always find a good starting point is to be curious about our starting point, what's present for us as we begin in this moment. And that might be breath. Hopefully there's breath there. But what is our sense of breath in this moment? It might include a sense of um, also the thoughts, feelings, emotions, and other body sensations besides the breath or along with the breath. And it can be especially helpful to, I find, to pay attention to our ground, how we connect with Mama Earth. I like to think of her as always there, holding us in her lap. And how is it to rest in to her support just now? Is it possible to feel that? And that might mean feeling where our body makes contact with what we're sitting on. Maybe a sense of the weight of the body resting down to our seat, probably our legs, our feet, making contact. There may be some sense of pressure into the contact, what we're sitting on. And it may be difficult to feel. And so welcome the first principle. Can we welcome what we actually do feel or what we actually are aware of? So what we might be aware of is of not being aware. And I know you work with trauma, Magda. I think your series is about that. That can be a sign of some history that hasn't been resolved. So can we welcome that intelligence in us that knows or has known that at some point we needed to not be aware in order to survive, to manage whatever it was. That might not be necessary now, but it might become a habit. And just bringing our awareness to it might begin to soften its hold on us. I notice myself slowing down as I'm talking about that. Slowing down is, in my experience, also a way to increase awareness. It's hard to be aware when we're rushing, trying to get through something. But when we begin to slow down, we can be more present. And then we can be more in choice rather than just acting out whatever our history is. So I want to invite all of us to take a moment just to see if it's possible to rest into this moment, whatever it may hold. What supports us in resting a bit more, in being. Working with trauma, we talk about resource, which is I think, a fancy word for support. what's resourcing for you in this moment? What helps you to know you're okay? You're safe in this moment. And that might be having your eyes open and being aware of what's in the room with you. I see my plants. Well, being on screen, I can see my plants behind me, and they're a great resource for me.
I'm just looking at the ones in front of me, so behind my computer. Yeah.
Plants can be a great resource. Nature can be a great resource. And thinking about a place I love to go to. Objects. I have my friend, this crystal, that I've had for many, many years. I just felt it lives up there on the shelf, but I just had a feeling to have it here. Felt good to have it present with me. I'm just remembering when I was a teenager, I used to walk around school holding a rock. It was like this big. I think I didn't know about grounding then, but I needed to ground. I needed that resource. Somebody wrote in my yearbook, I'll always remember you when you're rock. I think about that now that I understand more about trauma. I didn't understand anything about trauma back then, intellectually. My body did. Yeah. So, yeah. So being resourced, being present, might notice, what's a rock in our lives. And what happens? What's the felt sense of that in our bodies? And usually when we connect with some resource, we might take a deeper breath spontaneously or drop more down into the supportive moment or feel some softening in the body or some spreading, more space. Maybe we slow down a bit. We arrive here, more here. So I feel like I want to welcome you, Magda, and welcome everybody who's be watching this, listening to this here.
Thank you for that. And yeah, that's one of the things that I've been really learning, both in my own therapeutic process with someone who is trained and deeply experienced in the pre and perinatal work, and through the studies that I'm undergoing now in the subject, is how important it truly is to be welcomed, and how few of us have actually experienced it in a deep way, and especially in the first moments of our lives. And yeah, thank you for that moment of landing and grounding. And I feel a lot less stressed as well with the recording.
Great.
So that's great. And yeah, I can assume that at least some of the viewers will be as well. And as some of us may already know, it's so much easier to meet, to listen, to welcome someone else when we're actually present. So could you tell us a bit about you, Cherionna, and your path and your background and how you came to do this pre and perinatal work?
Well, I've been hinting that I had trauma and where to begin? I think my healing path began through my body telling me that I needed it. And the big moment of change in my life was I was a folk dance fanatic doing international folk dancing from all over the world, and had an accident doing that. Shouldn't be dangerous, but I had a concussion, and it changed my life. It wasn't a very serious concussion. I was dazed. I wasn't knocked out. But yeah, it was I think about it now, it was such a magical moment in a way. It's probably, maybe for a minute or so, I was basically paralyzed. There was so much shock. And I was an occupational therapist at the time. I was used to working with neurology, and there was a doctor in the group who came over and was asking me my name. I knew my name, but I couldn't get anything to work to actually say it. And I knew why she was asking me my name, make sure I was oriented and capable. I was oriented, but I wasn't capable in that moment. And eventually, I tried and tried and tried, and eventually I was able to say my name. And then I just started laughing and laughing, and the whole room started laughing too. We were all so relieved. But then they helped me over to the side of the room where there were some mats on the floor. And, I lay down on the mat to rest because they wanted to go back to dancing and I was in their way. And I have this memory of lying on that mat. At some point, I turned my head, and on the mat next to me was a newborn baby. And their parents had, wanted to dance. So they had the baby on the mat in case, they could tend to the baby, but the baby was sleeping. And I think about that now and I think, wow, that's so symbolic because in a moment in a way, I was born in that moment. And I didn't know anything about anything at that point. I knew about neurology. I knew about the medical approach. But I had some problems after the concussion and, they should have gone away a few months. And a year later, I was still having problems. So I went to a neurologist and he did a CAT scan. And when I went back for the results, they talk about the floor falling out from under your feet. So I had that experience because he said to me, what I see isn't what you would see with the concussion. What I see is what you would see with a deteriorative disease like MS, multiple sclerosis. And I'd been working with people with MS and often thought that's the last thing I'd want to have just because, it's very disabling and there's no cure. And he wanted to do, an invasive procedure that they do to diagnose that. And so I remember walking out of his office in a daze, just wandering through the neighborhood. And I believe something spoke to me in that moment and said, don't go back to him, just think of yourself as healthy. And I never went back and found myself guided to more alternative kinds of healing, which led me into my body. And as I started to come into my body, I started to encounter the trauma from my childhood. And I started working through that. And in the process, I studied body work, massage, and, in the training, more was coming up. And then I'm making a long story short here. That led me to somatic dance movement psychotherapy, which I ended up getting my master's in. And that program introduced me to pre and perinatal psychology. And I was like, that's it. I felt so drawn to that and ended up doing a Ph.D. in that. I think really because I needed that structure to help me to keep doing my healing because I realized there was a lot there. So, yeah, as part of all that, I studied very intensively with William Emerson, who's a major pioneer in the field. And then I came across Ray Castellino, who really became a mentor for me. And had brought in to the work much more gentle ways to do it rather than the old cathartic kinds of trauma work. He learned from his work with babies and children what little ones actually need. And part of that is slowing down and presence, welcome. He developed a whole set of principles, which I just find so incredibly helpful and I'm so grateful for. So my healing got much gentler at that point. And So I do work that's based on what I learned from him, as well as in the process of all that, I studied Biodynamic Craniosacral Therapy and met my dear husband, Fred Sills, who really developed that work. And that we ended up teaching. I was already teaching it, but we ended up teaching a lot together and discussing it for hours. And so those principles have also come into my work. And plus, in the process of all that, all that healing, I engaged in a lot of meditation and got very serious about Vipassana meditation, doing 10, 20, 30-day courses, in silence. So that aspect of mindful presence is a really strong influence in my work and my own healing as well. And I could say all of that has been really helpful for me in my own path. So
Yeah, thank you. What a rich journey.
yeah, I'm grateful. As I said, I felt guided into all of that.
Yeah, it does sound like it. And I can so relate to finding just pre and perinatal work and the gentleness and the tenderness and actually lack of interventions in some ways and just being and allowing for things to unfold. And both being really drawn to this world and also it's bringing a lot more gentleness and softness and slowness to my own healing process. So even though it's been a very short time for me in this world, I can already sense all of those things. So it's really beautiful. And for those of the viewers who have maybe never even heard of pre and perinatal psychology, or upon hearing it, they might be like, what? What do you mean prenatal psychology? Isn't psychology like, the psyche? Doesn't that develop later? So what is it?
Well, first of all, I feel like I want to go back to when I was studying somatic dance movement psychotherapy. What somatic means body-based. It's through the body. And people would say, well, no, but psychotherapy is talking therapy. Well, that's one form. But then there's all that our bodies hold that talking therapy doesn't get to. Talking therapy can be very useful. But a lot of our history, our trauma history, and our pre-verbal history before we develop language is all held in the body. We can't consciously access it, usually, very easily. So that's why I encountered pre and perinatal psychology as part of that training, because prenatal and birth experience naturally comes up when we're working with the body because it's there. So pre and perinatal psychology is the psychology of our experience before, pre means before, and around the time of birth. Peri is around. And that could be as much as maybe a year after birth. But it usually refers to, birth and maybe the first few weeks or months after that.
So around what we would call postpartum.
Exactly. Yeah. So the psychology of that time, the other thing I get a lot is, oh, you work with babies and mothers. And yeah, I do. But we've all been born. We've all been through it. And our experiences at that time of life profoundly affect us throughout our lives. And so the work applies to people of any age. And hopefully it happens pre-conception with the parents so they can do their work before they conceive so they don't have to pass it all on to their child. And that doesn't happen as much as we might hope. And, the earlier we can get to the person, the less entrenched their trauma is. But again, that's, it's not a very well-known field. So often most of the people I work with are adults. Even, there's one woman in the workshop who was in her 90s. I think that's really cool. Somebody in my training right now who's in his 70s. Like, yeah, it's never too late. So, yeah, and it affects us. So, yeah, I could talk a lot about that, but that's an introduction.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, like what prompted me to ask you to record this chat is one of your books, actually your newest book, which is called The Prenatal Shadow.
It's
And
my,
originally, sorry,
it's my baby.
yes, one of your babies. It's, as you can see, it's been,
You've been reading it.
I've been
Thank
reading
you.
it, I've been preparing. Um, and so originally I asked you to talk about kind of in general the material that you cover, but as I was looking at it, I decided no, it's impossible. There are just so many things in both of those periods. So I asked you if we could focus a bit more on the prenatal part now and then perinatal at a later date. Because as you say, our experiences at that time impact us so profoundly, and yet for many of us, even in the healing capacities, and even as practitioners and therapists, and even somatic therapists, a lot of us are not really aware of the depth and the richness and the crucial importance of those in utero experiences. And so you call it the prenatal shadow. So could you talk a bit about that and unpack it?
Yeah, well, in a way, it's just what you said, the unawareness. So, we've all had this experience. Why aren't we all aware of it? And so, first of all, shadow comes from the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, came up with the term, and he was referring to aspects of ourselves that are unacceptable or we perceive as unacceptable. And so we learn in order to be accepted, because we need that as children to survive, we learn to push that back and it can become unconscious. It may start off as unconscious, but as children are learning to talk, they often want to talk about or draw pictures of their early experience. And they're developing language and they're learning about what is okay to talk about. So, often if they're expressing something about their prenatal experience, it's received quite differently than, say, if talk about this in the book, if they go on a trip to the zoo and the next day they draw a picture of I think in the book I talk about the elephant and show it to their mother proudly, and mother goes, "Oh, that's the elephant we saw at the zoo yesterday with its big ears. And remember, we also saw the giraffe with its long neck." So she's reinforcing the memory. She's giving it language so the child can talk about it. And the child knows that's something real, that's something we talk about. That if the same child draws a picture of their experience in the womb, the mother may be curious. These days I think they're more likely to be curious than when I was a child, when somebody might have said, "Well, that's ridiculous, that's silly, draw a stick man, do something real." But even if the mother's curious, she's not likely to have a way to understand what it is because nobody talks about it. We're starting to come out of shadow. That's why I wrote the book. um, so, what happens is she says, "Well, that's a pretty picture. Let's go play this." Or, "Why don't you draw this flower?" Or, you know, often the child gets distracted or, they don't get the same reinforcement and reflection or language for it. So they learn that that's something that, isn't talked about, probably isn't real. So it gets pushed back. It's still there, shadow aspects are a part of us. And, welcome is the first principle. It's like they want to be welcomed. They want to be acknowledged. They want the light shone on them. And so they keep trying to get our attention. But if we're not conscious of them, they try to get our attention in ways that often aren't very pleasant or very functional. So they're acting out. Um, and that happens unconsciously. Okay. Or we project our shadow aspects onto other people. And so, if I wasn't allowed to be angry, that was a bad thing. I see somebody else as angry, who might not be even. Maybe they're trying to give me some feedback and I think they're being really angry at me. Right. And shadow isn't necessarily bad things. I think people tend to think of shadow as bad because it's unacceptable. But there can be really good qualities in shadow as well. Like, I think in the book I talk about, I see this a lot in pre-adolescent girls who are, girl might be really smart and doing really well in school. And then she hits adolescence and her peers acceptance becomes more important to her. And it's not cool to be smart, right? It's cool to be pretty. So she pretends to not be smart, or she stops putting effort into her schoolwork and, puts effort into her makeup and her clothes and her hair. And gradually she might forget that she is smart. And that intelligence is probably a good thing that's in shadow and waiting to be reclaimed. Right. So there's also in shadow what I call our original embryological potential, which is big words, but I see the embryo as having incredible potential. I have a passion for embryology, and I studied it as part of my Ph.D. in Pre and Perinatal Psychology, because it seems to me that we're learning through our bodies. We're always doing that, but especially before we have language and in the womb. The body is changing constantly, so I find it fascinating. But the embryo starts out as a little unicellular organism called the zygote when the sperm and egg come together. And it develops from that relatively simple body into these complex bodies. Like, that's amazing. That's incredible potential. And then it moves through all these various developmental milestones with challenges prenatally, which we've all gotten through, because we have this potential to do that. And we can come back to that potential. It tends to be in shadow. So, like, our incredible fluidity and resilience that embryos have, we're made up mostly of water, but embryos are made up even more of water. So we can access that. I forgot to mention the other major influence,
Yes.
which is continuum, a mindful movement practice developed by my other dear, dear mentor, Emily Conrad. And to me, that's a very direct way to access our embryological potential, because we drop into these embryo type states where we experience our incredible fluidity and can come out of our more rigid ways of being. So our potential can also be in shadow. We forget about it, or we get separated from it, and we can access it again. So shining the light on the shadow.
Yes. And you mentioned milestones, developmental milestones. And I guess many of us will be aware of the postnatal development milestones of, like, being able to maybe lift your head and then maybe roll to the side and then crawling and getting up and walking. So we are aware mostly of those. But I think for many of us, like developmental milestones in utero, that might be something that is what? So could you take us through the main ones?
Yeah. And just say, I was originally an occupational therapist. and OTs work with development. So I learned a lot about those developmental milestones you're talking about. So it's natural for me to look at embryological development as also being a series of milestones. So you might say the first one is conception. It's not necessarily easy or always successful. The thing about prenatal milestones is they tend to be about survival.
Mm.
If we pass them, we survive. If we're not resourced enough to meet the challenge, we don't usually. So they're very intense. So I'm going to slow down to talk about these. I find that just naming a whole series of prenatal milestones can send people into their prenatal trauma, and I don't want to do that. So I want to first of all acknowledge we've all gotten through them. And a milestone, well, any development involves meeting a challenge. If we don't have challenge, we don't have any reason to develop, like develop new skills, for example. So these milestones are various challenges, and we need enough resource to be able to meet them. So after conception, the next major one is implantation or nesting, where we nest into the wall of the womb. And we need to do that because we're running out of food at that point. And the uterine wall becomes our food for a little bit, and we burrow into it and connect with the mother's blood vessels and glands, which eventually develops into the placenta and umbilical cord. So that is often challenging, and that can relate to many things, but including how supported and resourced the mother feels or is, and her feelings about fertility, about having a baby, about being a woman and getting fat, and her relationship, how safe and secure she feels in that. She feels supported. And there can be ancestral, intergenerational influences there, where there's been trauma before. That's in her system, and that can affect her womb as well. So the wall of the womb may not be as delicious and soft and welcoming as we need it to be. So it may be an effort to implant. But we've all done it. And so then we get to the next major milestone. There are littler, smaller milestones in between, but the next major one is what we call discovery. And that's a term from William Emerson. And he he defined it as the time when the pregnancy is confirmed by a pregnancy test. And often women or couples are aware of being pregnant earlier. Some are aware right away. And these days, pregnancy tests can happen much earlier. But the time of discovery tends to happen around the time that the heart starts to beat, which is day 22. Because so by that point, even if they could have had a pregnancy test earlier, by this point, the woman realizes she's missed her period and she does the test, right? So issues around discovery tend to be held in the area that's discovering at the time. Sorry, that is developing at the time, which is the heart and chest. And there can be all kinds of issues from discovery. Discovery is when you might say we're consciously welcomed. by the parents, hopefully, ideally. We need that. But most often, so apparently, most conceptions aren't planned. And so there's going to be at least some degree of ambivalence around discovering the pregnancy. Even when the pregnancy is planned, often the parents are like, oh my God, it happened, I haven't done this yet, So that doesn't seem like a terribly negative thing. But for the baby who's completely dependent on the parents accepting them and welcoming them and protecting them and feeding them, that can be absolutely terrifying. And so that can be a very challenging time. Those are probably the major prenatal milestones. There are other things that happen prenatally, but they're not really milestones. So.
Yes, thank you. And just as you mentioned now, like those are such important moments that happen so early into our physical existence in the womb. And it might seem incredulous for some people that those moments and those experiences would shape the rest of our lives, and whether we feel safe, how we connect and relate, whether we can receive nourishment, and all the different pieces. And yet, through different research, through people who have dedicated their lives and professional paths and careers like you and the mentors you mentioned, many of your peers, to pre and perinatal psychology, we actually know it's a fact. It's not something that we are making up theories about. No, it's happening. And earlier you also mentioned that if we have certain experiences that are in the shadow and we're still holding them in a way that is unaware, hasn't been named and reflected, and we haven't been able to really embody the potential that comes with those different experiences, if we are resourced enough, we might be playing out certain things, and we might be experiencing behaviors, patterns, illnesses that are trying to show us, hey, I'm here. I experienced this. Please see me and acknowledge me. And in your book, you talk about natalism. So could you define that a bit?
Yeah. Natalism wasn't my term. I think actually there's somebody called Michael Irving, who I think he came up with the term, but it may have been before him. He looked at at least birth symbolism, probably prenatal as well, in art, visual art. And I looked a lot at natalism in my dissertation, my Ph.D., which was about prenatal and birth, how it was represented in dance and movement. And my committee pointed out that movement is in everything, so I basically had to include everything. So I looked at art and myth and ritual and all that, and quite fascinated by that whole idea. Natalism is the symbolic representation of birth. And so, what I saw, I found really interesting, because I was into folk dancing, right? That in folk dances all over the world, people will form a circle, like a womb, and they go into the center of it and back out, contractions. In American folk dancing, like, what's it called? The big circle dance. You have a huge big circle, it'd be like the whole town, Everybody holding hands and into the center with a whoop and a shout, woohoo, and then back out. These are like contractions, right? Or people will form two lines, two rows, and one person or a couple will go through, and sometimes they'll form, they'll put their hands above like that. Or it's like a tunnel, like a birth canal. It's fascinating how we do that. The other thing I find quite obvious um, is like, and this happens in so many places in folk dancing and in ballet, you see it also. The woman dancing in her little white dress, her little fluffy, big skirt, right? Looks like an egg. And male dancers often all around her in their little sperm outfits, it's just so obvious. And it's like they finally connect, and they are fertility dances originally, you know. So, and I think folk dancing was used. I don't know if it's, I think we have other kinds of dance now, but it's basically to flirt, find your partner. So we still do that through dance, right? Uh, and even, um, couple dancing where people, like the man and the woman, are holding each other and spinning. That's how I had my concussion, interestingly enough. Like the shock of coming in. Um, when the sperm and the egg come together, there is a spinning that happens. Uh, um, so it's interesting. I don't think I knew that when I did the dissertation, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So you're giving like, yeah, pretty fun. Now I'll probably, anytime I see ballet, I'll be thinking about, conception trying to happen. So you talk about how unconsciously we put it into our art, into our movement, into our dance. And then if we were not resourced enough to have a really nourishing experience during those developmental milestones, how might we be doing this natalism, this reenactment in our relationships in our daily life? How could that affect us?
Right. Well, I know you were interested in prenatal.
Uh,
This,
yeah.
maybe I'll stick with some prenatal. Um, and I can give myself as an example for my implantation was really difficult.
Mm.
And so implantation is about finding a home in the womb, right? As well as finding food. And so some uh, pre and perinatal therapists believe that, or have from their experience, that difficulty with implantation can lead to eating disorders. It's like always looking for what you didn't get. But how I really saw it in my life, it just played out so clearly once I knew what I was doing, um, is that I moved at least once a year as an adult. And, it's back in the day before we had digital everything. And my friends would complain that I filled up their entire address book because my address kept changing, right? Um, so, that was me trying to find a place to implant. I didn't know that. But my implantation experience was that it's like I tried here and I tried there. It was just really hard to get in. But I finally did manage. So I did a lot of healing around that. And um, well, maybe I'll mention. So one of the other challenges that's very common, it's not a milestone necessarily, but very common trauma prenatally is to lose a twin. Apparently more than half of conceptions, human conceptions, are multiple, and fewer than half of births are multiple, which means a lot of us have lost a twin. And it comes up all the time in pre and perinatal work. So many people have relate to that experience. And so I remember losing a twin. And before I did my healing around that, it's like I was twinning with people. I had my relationship. I go, oh, there he is. My twin was a boy. So, I was like, there, he's the one. And before I hardly even knew him, right? And so then we'd get into this hot and heavy relationship. And after a little while, I go, oh, that's not who I thought he was. And then I'd end the relationship, right? So my relationships were like my homes. They didn't last very long. And then finally, I spent 11 years on my own and just, I wasn't really looking for anybody. I'm happy on my own. I thought it'd be nice to have somebody to get old with, but in the meantime, I did all this pre and perinatal work and a lot of other healing work. Um, and then I met Franklin. Well, Franklin I had met before, but we connected. And I ended up moving here to England. I'm from Canada, and I was living in the States at that time. And so we got together 17 years ago. I moved here 15 years ago. That's completely unheard of for me in my history. The longest I'd be with someone was 2 years. That was a long time. So, and we fall in love every day still, you know. So, um, I did recognize a connection with him. It was more like a soul connection. It wasn't like him being my twin. So there was actually room for him to be who he was and for me to be who I am, which is very different from just acting out my history, my shadow of the twin loss.
Yeah, I was laughing because it's been part of my journey and my discovering some of my pre and perinatal, like prenatal in this case, experiences and things that I had struggled with relationally. And I just couldn't understand. Like I had been in, psychotherapies and doing nervous system work and this work and that. Why could it why did I keep on making kind of the same choices and doing the same things, even though, in many other areas, I had so much more capacity to choose differently. And it wasn't until I landed in that piece that things just connected and everything made so much sense. Both my experiences in between relationships and how I would get into relationships. And I was like, wow, okay, now I know. Now I understand. So yeah.
Yeah, it's powerful. I'm glad you found that. Can I give another example that just occurs to me just now? Hearing you say between relationships, I'm thinking about the pandemic that happened not that long ago. And, a lot of people being isolated in their homes. And for some people, that was a time to be really creative and they really enjoyed it. I did lots of things online. For other people, it was absolute torture. And they got depressed, they felt really isolated. And I suspect for a lot of those people, it was a reflection of their experience early on, either in the womb or around the time of birth. But when they weren't being met the way they needed to be met, they weren't having their needs met. And so they're dependent on, getting a lot of interaction from other people. So I found that kind of fascinating. Sad also, people had to suffer so much.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when I learned about nervous system regulation work, like my lens changed so much. And the way I see myself, other people, the state of the world, like I saw everything through the lens of regulation, dysregulation. And now I feel like through encountering the pre and perinatal psychology, I'm kind of getting another lens.
Mhm.
And now beginning to see everything through those earliest experiences. And again, certain things just start making so much more sense.
Mhm.
And I know we'll have to finish in a moment. So maybe, if it's okay, one thing that I would like you to share a bit about before we go is the idea of double binds. because that's something I haven't come across before, this work, and I think it's pretty important. And I know in some ways you've mentioned some of the double binds, like the implantation, right? Like I need to be eating of the wall of my mother's womb, and yet it's toxic for me. It's not good for me. So in order to survive, I have to be taking in that toxicity. So
Right.
could you talk a bit about that?
Right. So that's, what I hear you describing is what we call umbilical toxicity or umbilical affect, that what's coming in
Mm.
from the mother is toxic, and yet we're dependent on it. I'm aware we have a double bind right now. It feels like we could talk for hours and we have 5 minutes. So a double bind, I really learned about double binds from Ray Castellino. And what I learned from him is a double bind means that there's different things happening, and they don't, they're in conflict with each other. There's no um, satisfying solution. It's like say you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Okay, so like with the umbilical toxicity, you know, I need food to survive. And if I do take of that food, I get the toxicity. I need to avoid the toxicity to survive. But if I do, I starve. There's no happy solution there. And I find it's really helpful to talk about double binds right in the beginning of doing this work. If I do a workshop, we talk about it near the beginning. And one of the most helpful things in freeing ourselves from the effects of double binds is to name, oh, this is a double bind. And when we're dealing with very early history as double binds, that's probably extra important because our memory of what happened pre-verbally, as well as a lot of trauma memory, is implicit, meaning it's not explicit in words or linear or conscious. It's in our bodies, in our tissues, in our behaviors, in our perceptions, right? And our yeah, how we experience life. So implicit memory, when it comes up, feels like it's happening now. And so that can be very confusing when there's been a double bind that was life or death. When it comes up, it feels like this moment now is life or death. So that's when you really need to practice regulating your nervous system, right? But naming the double bind and being able to differentiate between now and then. So little ones aren't able to do that when something comes up. They just experience it directly, right? Because that part of the brain hasn't developed yet. And implicit memory isn't linear. Little ones aren't linear. They're just experiencing it all directly. Okay? But be able to name it and say, okay, this is like what happened to me in the womb. This is like my implantation experience, or this is like, my umbilical experience. And oh, I'm not in the womb now. I'm 70 years old now. It's like maybe I'm okay, right? I've survived this long. You know, Often I'll ask people, somebody like this gone right into their early trauma, and I go, and what's your current age? And they go, oh, and they snap right out of it because, with their current age, we have resources. We are capable. It's very different. So to be able to differentiate and to be able to name, this is a double bind. This is a double bind from my early history, if we know that much. So liberating.
Yes. Yes.
There's hope.
Yes, there is. And as you say, we're capable. We've made it thus far, even if we have challenges and different things that we are struggling with and wanting support with. we are here, and there are ways, there are modalities, there are lineages of understanding and offering that support that can really help us in a very deep and all-encompassing way. So thank you for being one of those people. And thank you for your book and all your previous books and your teachings. And thank you for being here today. And I'm really looking forward to speaking again at some point.
Yeah, thank you. Me too. And I just feel to say how fortunate we are, that like I think about my parents' generation and certainly my grandparents' generation, they didn't have the opportunity to do this work. First of all, there was so little known about it, but also their lives were more about survival.
Yes.
You know? Like we actually can do this. And what a great gift we have. And thank you also for doing your work. I think it's wonderful you're bringing this into Polish.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Until next time.
Until next time.